Paul McCartney and Wings were playing. We were determined to get backstage at any cost, in any way. We did.
The fact that I got to go on 2 Led Zeppelin tours was like a rite of passage for me.
Eventually I found myself in a room with Keith Richards and Ron Wood.
I did a piece for Creem when I went on the road with the Ramones in Texas.
Leonard Skinner was a really important story for me.
They were on the tour with the Runaways.
But if you had to pick my favorite assignment, it would probably be George Harrison.
The Clash, I remember when they were at the Motor City roller rink. That was a great assignment. I loved it.
My responsibility, as I see it as a critic, is not to help a lot of new bands sell their records. It's to help people that are buying the records.
Rock writers like priests and life coaches and the crazy person screaming on the street corner are here to try and show you the true and righteous way and what matters. Because music matters. Damn it, it really does.
There are 2 parts of being a good critic. First, you have to know what you like. And second, you have to be able to explain honestly why you like it, even if the reason is completely disgraceful.
Tradition of critics in the printed word goes back to newspapers, and critics would review theater, plays, opera, books.
The first critic, Caveman, would say, you know, over by the bushes down in the valley, the hunting's very good. Over by the lake, not so good.
I wrote my editor, I said, you will not assign this to anybody but me.
I'm Paul Mejia. I'm a freelance arts and culture critic.
I'm Kent Walgamot. I am the music critic, rock critic at the Lincoln Journal-Star in Lincoln, Nebraska.
There's an innate human need to explicate our surroundings.
Really engaging art from a thoughtful perspective is an art in itself.
I always feel like I'm the filter between the fan and the artist.
Any damn fool can create art. It's the critic who's really important, because without stepping forward to say that this was good art or bad art, who cares?
When I found I was writing something that was positive, everybody thought, you know, there was this fear that you were drinking the Kool-Aid.
It's always been a lot easier to trash something. I'm good with punchlines and jokes, so it's never hard for me to make fun of something. To try and find out why something works, I think is a lot more difficult. And I think that's the value that a critic can have.
I'm from western Nebraska, which is the absolute middle of nowhere. And the way I found out about stuff was through the magazines.
When I was growing up, there was no way to preview music. You really relied on the rock press.
At night, we'd be in bed reading those before we went to sleep. In school, you'd be reading, you'd be taken away from you in school.
You get invited out almost every night.
Look at the cool things you get to do. You get to listen to music, go to the concerts, hang out with the musicians, all of that kind of stuff.
In the 70s, that was sort of the golden age of that.
Free records, yeah, lots of free records.
Too many million words have already been written about what the music purportedly is. I'm writing about what it absolutely isn't.
I write a lot better about bands I care little for. Because I'm much more free with what I'll ask them. If I like somebody, I have to force myself to ask the hard questions.
They finally fired me because I said something bad about Christmas.
My drinking buddy ended up the editor of the campus newspaper. And one very drunken night, he says to me, well, Tim, you know about music. You like a lot of music. You want to be the rock critic for the paper? Basically get paid like $50
To write about a record and they're giving me the record for free? Fuck yeah, sign me up.
Did we get any respect as rock writers? Absolutely.
The 1960s, a time of turmoil and tension, experimentation and creativity. There were revolutions in the arts, music, film, and literature.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Taking their cue from the Lost Generation and the Beats, a new young breed of writers emerged. The rock critics, the music journalists who wrote for magazines such as Rolling Stone, Creem, and Hit Parader, providing news, information, and commentary about the exploding music scene and youth culture. The music was the revolution's soundtrack, and the magazines, with their flamboyant rock critics, interpreted the music for a whole generation.
You know the Frank Zappa quote, rock journalism is people who can't write, interviewing people who have nothing to say from people who can't read.
In the 1950s, I think there were certainly jazz magazines like Downbeat, I think was already going, and certainly some similar to that. I think there was one called
Dig, which covered a bit of the music scene and had guest columns by disc jockeys.
It's like a cat and mouse thing with the critics and the musicians.
In the beginning, there were two kinds of publications. There were fan magazines with nice pictures of the stars and their lyrics reprinted.
I remember buying like a Tiger Beat.
And there were, newspaper articles saying this was a juvenile delinquent scourge. It was going to be the ruination of our youth.
Hit Parader was the first thing we had our photo in.
16 magazine and Gloria Stavers, and Gloria Stavers was a very hip person, even though she was running this teeny bop magazine. She was one of Lenny Bruce's girlfriends.
Magazines like The Old Mole out of Boston.
All of a sudden there was a plethora of magazines about the invasion of the British sound. The Beatles had their own magazines being published about them, and consequently there was getting to be like a need for people to be able to read more about the new music revolution going on at the time.
I think you can mark that change around the mid-60s.
When people were dropping out of their master's and PhD programs in college, no longer writing about Plato's Republic, but writing 17,000-word treatises on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, that people began taking rock writing seriously.
The first rock critic I remember really reading was Ellen Willis.
Greil Marcus.
Greil Marcus is a great writer.
Sandy Pearlman, who wrote for Crawdaddy. Lillian Roxon. She was one of the first people to really champion the Velvet Underground.
John Landau.
Nick Toshas. Ken Barnes too. I could read those writers and want to go pick up a record.
Lester Bangs, who got me started.
Then you had Lester Bangs, who was the Hunter Thompson of rock journalism.
Dave Marsh and Lester were my two favorites, and of course Mentors.
Richard Meltzer, who, like Lester Bangs, he really carried on the tradition of beat literature of Kerouac and Ginsberg and all, and translated that into a new kind of beat literature for our generation.
And Mark Schipper was probably the funniest guy to write about rock and roll. He wrote this paperback writer book, which was about what happens if the Beatles come back and they have to open the bill for Peter Frampton, which was just classic.
How many people now write tiny little, 3 or 4 sentence reviews? That comes right out of Robert Christgau doing the Consumer Guide.
We were fortunate here in San Francisco to have a fellow like Ralph J. Gleason.
For the San Francisco Chronicle.
He was the first one to really comment about the scene happening in San Francisco in 1966.
It was Richard Goldstein at the Village Voice.
And the Village Voice was, I think, where I really started reading rock criticism that took the music seriously.
ID Magazine, I mean, it was cool to be, in ID Magazine back in the day, Big Brother.
Hit Parader did more as time went on than just running lyrics of songs.
You got accustomed to something new happening in popular music almost every month. I mean, it seemed normal that you had the Beatles, and contemporaneous with the Beatles, you had Motown's Greatest Hour, you had the Beach Boys' Greatest Hour, you had the Four Seasons' Greatest Hour, and then that morphed into the Byrds and folk rock, and good time music with the Lovin' Spoonful, and then that turned into psychedelic out of San Francisco and England and Los Angeles after that. So the order of the day seemed to be, well, this thing is just going to keep turning over great stuff regularly. That's what's going to happen. So the enthusiasm to write about it was, my God, you got to do this.
In 1966, the first rock magazines were born. Crawdaddy on the East Coast, Mojo Navigator on the West.
I'd like to give credit to Greg Shaw and Paul Williams, who each began to put out their own rock fanzines.
Paul Williams and Crawdaddy kind of started it off.
Science fiction and science fiction fandom was this wonderful breeding ground. You know, it was the free thinkers of the day. That's where fanzines came from, was the science fiction world. Okay, if you can do that with science fiction, you could also do that with rock and roll or with other things.
There were people who had their own little magazines and would write about, you know, Isaac Asimov or something.
Around 14, he started a science fiction fanzine called Within. A year or so later, he started Crawdaddy. And he'd had that experience of already knowing how to mimeograph.
I think it was probably the magazine I bought after we were looking at the monkeys and yardbirds, and 16 magazine was Crawdaddy, probably around 66 right then.
This friend of mine introduced me to Paul Williams, and Paul Williams just hit on me mercilessly to write him articles.
So Crawdaddy kind of started as a place where you could write about the stuff that you loved.
I wrote an article called San Francisco Bay Rock for Crawdaddy, which is apparently the first national magazine article about the San Francisco scene.
He was giving serious, in-depth reviews to, you know, the Byrds and the Buffalo Springfield, of course Dylan, Beatles, and Stones.
When I was a senior in high school, rock and roll had started talking to me in a big way. Then one day in late January 1966, I was in a drugstore off campus looking at fan magazines aimed at teenage girls. I read that two of my favorite bands, the Yardbirds and the Rolling Stones, had got their start playing in a club in Richmond, Surrey, England, called the Crawdaddy Club. And it hit me in a blinding flash that it was now time to start this rock and roll magazine I'd been thinking about, and that it should be called Crawdaddy. The most noteworthy response to the new magazine came later in the week, when Paul Simon called me at the freshman dormitory to say that my review was the first intelligent thing that had been written about their music.
The first magazine I wanted to write for nationally was Crawdaddy, because Crawdaddy had been the first serious music magazine, and I discovered Richard Meltzer and Sandy Pearlman.
Four most important original writers for Crawdaddy were, of course, Paul Williams, Richard Meltzer, John Landau, and myself. To a great extent, we kind of created the canon.
Meanwhile, I've been reading the Village Voice, and anyway, it said, behind an apartment door on 6th Avenue, an 18-year-old ego burns. And it was a story of Paul coming to town and trying to launch his magazine in New York.
I don't really know how many people read Crawdaddy. I would imagine precious few. But amongst the people who were reading the magazine were the very wealthy lone maniacs who ran the record companies.
Shortly after the second issue went into the mail, I saw a notice in the Philadelphia paper that Bob Dylan would perform at the Academy of Music on February 24th and 25th. So I mailed the first two issues to the theater, asking for a press ticket to the concerts.
This guy behind me, this skinny kid, stood up and he was like looking at the crowd really intently. And every now and again he'd see somebody and he'd pull out this magazine and he'd go running over to them, and then he'd come back and he'd scout it around some more. And finally I noticed the magazine was Crawdaddy. Oh, this must be. So I said, "Excuse me, are you Paul Williams?" He goes, "Yeah."
So it came to pass that one day, when I walked into the freshman dorm, Worrying about when or whether I'd get the third issue out, another student shouted, "Hey, Williams, Bob Dylan called you."
During the Summer of Love, I came out to San Francisco once with Meltzer and once with Paul Williams. And I remember that Jan Wenner was kind of hanging around with us, and he wanted to create what became Rolling Stone.
Dylan was friendly and open and talkative. At one point, he kidded me by pointing to a line in my Simon and Garfunkel review. Quote, "They go for the essentials, never committing the Dylan-esque crime of 10-minute songs full of everything but the kitchen sink."
And he wanted us to be, his partners in it. What turns out to be a colossal mistake. Paul turned it down.
Paul only stayed with Crawdaddy for 2 years. He started it at the beginning of '66, and by the end of '68, he was done. He didn't want to have to go after people and get advertising. His mother used to tell me, you have to remember, when I had him tested, he had 180 IQ. He could have done whatever he wanted. He didn't want to be an entrepreneur. He wanted to be a writer.
All the while, Crawdaddy writer Richard Meltzer was working on a first-of-its-kind manuscript. Too long for a music review, it was part philosophic treatise, part encyclopedia, the first serious book about rock and roll, the aesthetics of rock.
Richard took what was kind of a graduating thesis, and it became the very famous book, The Aesthetics of Rock. In my opinion, the finest book ever written about rock and roll.
A lot of what Paul printed in the early Crawdaddies was really pretentious, and certainly Meltzer's Aesthetics of Rock was pretentious.
It got turned down here and there and everywhere, maybe 12 times. Bob Dylan wanted $1,000 for every quote, so they cut a lot of him out of the book. Eventually we got the rights to use all the Beatle lyrics. John was connected to this too because Yoko knew the publisher. I never met John, I never met Paul, but both of them had a hand in me being permitted to use Beatle lyrics. I wrote it in '65, it didn't come out till '70. It was easily the first rock book written where I just delved into every single aspect of the damn thing that I could. Used a lot of big words.
I used to sit next to, in at least one of my history classes, a guy who would become fairly important later on, John Landau. He went on to become a rock producer and a very famous rock writer. Is he a billionaire? Probably, because he's not only the producer of all these records, not only the manager of Bruce Springsteen, but of course also the one of the producers of James Cameron. So, Terminator.
Meanwhile, Greg Shaw was starting Mojo Navigator in San Francisco.
Greg was based in San Francisco, and he started Mojo Navigator.
They had a mimeographed, maybe 8 or 12-page fanzine called the Mojo Navigator Rock and Roll News, and I bought it. And it was like a mimeographed sheet that came out that would go to the record stores.
That started around 66, 67, and was timed just as San Francisco became the hippest place on the planet.
Suddenly, the music magazines needed writers. The Monterey Pop Festival in June '67 was the first massive outdoor concert of the newly anointed Flower Power generation. Bands and young people from all over the United States and Britain converged on California, attracting the attention of the major record labels.
When I started, in the whole world, there were only 20 bands worth listening to. And after the Monterey Pop Festival, there were like thousands of bands being released.
The single ceased to be the measuring rod for a band, and the album was taking over.
You started hearing things that weren't hit singles by bands that clearly weren't aiming for hit singles. I mean, Inagata Davida was never going to be a hit single because it was 18 minutes long.
record companies decided after that that they could buy into all this new music. Every record company bought more bands than they know what to do with, just so somebody else wouldn't have them.
In the 60s, if you got a record and got like a lot of good reviews, you get your chance to make a second or third record, even though the record didn't sell that much.
What came out of that was money. They had these different departments, like promotion was basically airplay, like bribing people with cocaine to play stuff on the air, and billboards, advertisements, and print media. And then there was publicity, which was basically taking writers to lunch.
I think it was over at Cal Berkeley that Jan Werner was writing about stuff in his publication under the pseudonym of Mr. Jones.
In 1967, I wrote the first U.S. review of Jimi Hendrix. I reviewed the first album, Are You Experienced? And ran into him after that. He says, "Oh man, you know, were you stoned when you wrote that? That was really fantastic." And it was just that the bands felt that the writers were co-conspirators.
6 months later, in November 1967, Jan Wenner, a student writer for the Berkeley Barb, founded what would become the world's most successful music magazine, Rolling Stone.
The national one, the one that reached western Nebraska, probably first was Rolling Stone.
Rolling Stone's virtue is that it overnight professionalized this whole field.
I was just lucky enough, I think, at San Francisco State, where I was a student from about 62 to 66, to be witness to the beginning of what got to be known as the San Francisco scene.
It was well art directed, really well written, and ultimately had advertisements for Ford and Chevy in it.
I was witness to scenes like one of the first rehearsals of Janis Joplin joining Big Brother and the holding company. Another day, there was a free noon lunchtime rally outside the men's gym, and the attraction was Grace Slick. And so I felt when Rolling Stone came along that I was in a pretty good position. I was lucky enough to get a job there, and at that time, it was still only about 6-7 months old. Jan called me in to consider being an editor there, and so I said yes. And at that time, it was still the rent-free loft above a printing plant. And we were all kind of there together in one or two great big rooms, putting out this paper.
I started writing record reviews there in the summer of '69.
It was an exhilarating time.
I got contacted by the record review editor, who was a guy named Grail Marcus.
Grail Marcus, who, you know, you couldn't get him to like certain things no matter what you tried to point out. It seemed like he was one of those people that would just go against the grain just to get your attention. It's something.
Jan Wenner, the editor-publisher, was expanding the staff, hiring a whole bunch of new people, and so he asked Grail who should replace him, and he said I should.
We would go out and go to the Matrix nightclub and see the airplane, the house band, the Jefferson Airplane, or go to the California Hall, go to the park, go to the Fillmore, and from that, along with some clips from the British newspapers, create the next issue of Rolling Stone.
And then Altamont took place. They wanted to do a big major, you know, most of the issue of the magazine devoted to that.
Jan was nuts to put out a magazine every 2 weeks instead of what God always intended, once a month. And so instead, we were constantly grinding. Every issue was due right away.
You'd have people like Ed Ward and Ben Fong-Torres and folks that were at the offices down the street from us coming, checking out records from us, borrowing albums from us at times, which was cool.
And in March 1970, I flew out there and got to work as the new record review editor of Rolling Stone.
Rolling Stone was always an interesting newspaper because it did have a lot more going on having to do with the scene and covering radio stuff and having the political aspects of it also.
There was a political sensibility from the very beginning. Even in the first few issues, there would be some stories about what's going on in terms of the war protests, civil rights, all of that, and politics in general.
I already knew Lester Bangs because Grill had handed his huge pile of stuff that he just sent in.
Lester and I had first met that summer of '69. Rolling Stone had brought him up to the Bay Area, and they liked his writing.
I mean, he said, be careful, this guy, he'll write the entire magazine if he thinks he can get away with it, and you really have to get some balance in here.
He thought they were considering hiring him, and they didn't.
Soon, the first glaring conflict emerged in the new genre of rock journalism. On the one hand, there were the writers, mavericks, rebels, a band of outsiders who wrote because they didn't fit in anywhere else. On the other hand, there were the publishers like Jan Wenner, who saw the economic, cultural potential of the music magazine and sought to professionalize this less than 2-year-old industry.
Rolling Stone's music coverage has always been corrupt to its commercial interests.
6 months later, along with most of the rest of the staff, I was fired.
It's really been a piece of shit since 1968.
John Landau took my job over.
And that's one of the calmer exits from Rolling Stone. Just ask Ed Ward.
Except for Ben Fong-Torres and Charlie Perry, everybody was replaced. Everybody.
Rolling Stone kind of went by the wayside because I think it seemed corporate to us.
Wenner wanted employees. He didn't want people who thought for themselves.
Rolling Stone, I think, was a little bit more siding with record companies.
You know, Bangs was not welcome in the pages. You know, Tasha's was not welcome. Meltzer was not welcome. Anybody with a voice. Mendelssohn did his stint and then it was not welcome. You know, these early, anybody who was going to try to have a voice that was bigger than the institution they were going to slave for was not really welcome.
My sister-in-law actually worked for Rolling Stone. She was always one of those people that had to really put up with Jan and Jan Werner.
He was out of the country when we did the issue that won Rolling Stone its Columbia Journalism Award. And I don't think he really appreciated the fact that he was thousands of miles away chasing his wife on the Orient Express when we were making history.
And also people like Hunter Thompson, who would come in with all their notes written down on napkins and such.
By 1969, the counterculture meant different things in different parts of the country. Different cities had different musical tastes. Rolling Stone came to define the breezier West Coast sound of folk rock and California hippie politics. But in Detroit, Michigan, young people gave the counterculture a rougher, industrial edge. Born out of the auto industry, Detroit's youth chose the heavy factory-like sounds of the MC5 over Joni Mitchell, Motown soul over California's endless summer. Out of this, rock's next great magazine, Creem, hammered its way onto the scene.
It was like we all heard this shrill dog whistle and we all ended up at the same place.
Creem wasn't so much political as it was sarcastic, making fun of rock people, bringing them down, knocking them down to size.
All of us had something a little wrong with us, you know, a little off, a little outsidery.
Creem was just like, they'd make everybody mad.
And we found our group, we found our tribe together.
It's such an interesting town because in those days it was truly a factory town for the autos. You followed your father to work the assembly line at Ford.
But these were escapes from that city, from that Detroit, that raw grittiness.
Certainly at Creem we had a contentious relationship with some of them. I would say a lot of the rock stars hated rock critics.
Rolling Stone seemed to not have the spirit of garagey, attitudinal 50s and earlier 60s stuff that Creem did have.
When you're in Detroit and you work for Creem magazine, you were a little bit of a rock star.
I used to work at the Grandie Ballroom. I was the Coca-Cola girl. My job was to make sure that people didn't spike the drinks with LSD.
You went to every show for free. You could go to bars and tell people you work for Creem, you get free drinks.
And right next to the bar was the Creem magazine kiosk where they sold Creem magazines. So I would always ask the people, I'd give them free Cokes, and I'd go, come on, I have to write for Creem magazine, get me in there. What can you do to help me?
I remember that was the first time I had seen Alice Cooper and Iggy and the Stooges.
And I was reading an underground newspaper in Detroit called The Fifth Estate, and I saw an ad that said, typist who likes rock and roll.
Creem magazine got as much across in their funny captions to their pictures as they did in the articles.
A few months after that, I asked Dave Marsh, who was freaking out that he couldn't make the deadline and do his column, and I offered to write his column.
Part of Creem's magic came from the mercurial personality of its founder, Barry Kramer. Kramer blended 60s revolution with 70s materialism, the eclectic mix needed to publish a rock and roll magazine.
Creem was unique in that Barry Kramer, its founder, was part White Panther, let's take to the barricades, radical revolutionary, and part wannabe Jan Wenner, which should sure be nice to have a corporate jet.
He really was a go-getter. I mean, he really kept that magazine alive for a long time.
He let his writers have a lot more freedom than any other publication.
Pulling every string he could think of to keep it afloat.
He probably hired us because he worked for $22.75 a week, but I think that he just saw a spark in us.
One of the things that really appealed to me about Creem was that in its pages I thought everybody was snotty and irreverent, but they weren't nasty. And that kind of meant a lot to me.
We had this strange communal family. I mean, it was the year of the commune. We all lived together. It's like we all were working for like less than slave wages.
Creem was another one of those magazines that was done by all enthusiasts, and they had no background in putting out a publication.
I felt that I was being given a lot of female music. The guys would take the stuff that they felt was pretty high profile. It was this like female gulag or something. You know, it was like, oh, here's the Maria Muldaur album. We should have a review of that. Here, Robbie. And I'm like...
We used to travel en masse, and we would all go to shows together. We would go to these press parties together.
I was doing some music stuff, but I was also editing the film section. And I had started a column that was kind of a gossip column, an anonymous gossip column called Confessions of the Film Fox.
Someone like Lester would incite a riot. He'd start throwing food at some English rock band.
They were going to do a major expansion too, because they were sure that San Francisco was too hippified and that Rolling Stone was going to get too mellow, which was all correct. And so I became the West Coast editor of Creem.
Barry made a deal for me to come to Detroit, get the magazine more professional. It was always full of typos.
We were rock stars.
Back at the dawn of the indie rock revolution, I put out a record with a band called Sneakers on a 7-inch, and we just sent it off in the mail to these magazines, and we're amazed that we got reviewed as if we were a real band.
By the early 70s, alternative print media culture was in full bloom. Magazines, alt weeklies, fanzines, free presses, and student rags sprouted up all over the country.
There were so many rock magazines back then, and they came and went so fast.
Focus.
Zoo World.
Gig.
Musician.
Sundance.
Zygote.
Earth.
Music and sound output.
Circus. That was fairly large.
Late 60s, early 70s, there was nothing on television about music, so you either saw it live or you read about it in a newspaper or a magazine.
I sent in a over the transom submission to a folk magazine called Broadside, and they printed it. Didn't pay me for it.
So I spent the next couple of years trying to write for them, and in fact, my wall over there, I have a couple of framed rejection notices from Lester Bangs and people like that.
A great source of ads was the record companies who had full-page ads ready to go.
The scene in LA exploded. Plus, all the record labels were located in Los Angeles. Greg Shaw, who started Mojo Navigator in San Francisco, moved to LA, bringing several music critics with him. Together, they would build up both Phonograph Record magazine, owned by United Artists, and the edgier Who Put the Bump.
There was an exodus of some of us writers from the Bay Area following Greg Shaw.
Mojo Navigator kind of fell apart around 67, 68.
Shaw came down here to Burbank, and he came down here to work for United Artists Records, which was putting out their own house organ called Phonograph Record magazine.
Under a guy named Marty Cerf, who's one of the real neglected figures.
And a clatch of people sort of gathered around Shaw and United Artists and got to write liner notes and write for Phonograph Record magazine.
Bump started out as a fanzine in the purest sense, you know, stapled together at collating parties and circulated by mail to just a few dedicated fans.
In Who Put the Bump, he was able to just go with Ken's great editorship too, or co-editorship, go right to the meat. If you want Lester to write 20 pages about account 5, go to it.
But as it got bigger, the covers got slicker, became published in actual magazine form. Lester Bangs was in there. Most of the New York people were in there. And also a bunch of LA people.
Lester Bangs did a piece called James Taylor, Marked for Death, which was published in Greg Shaw's fanzine, Who Put the Bomb, in 1971, I believe. And despite the title, there was only a little bit about James Taylor in it. It was mostly about a celebration of the Trogs, who had had the hit with Wild Thing in the mid-60s. And it was really an important piece because the mainstream critics, rock critics, had dismissed groups like the Trogs as being juvenile and beneath their interest and so forth. And Lester was saying that groups like this really were important.
Bump expanded during that period. We did very ambitious issues. We did like a gigantic British invasion, and then there were big ones on American garage rock, you know, the reaction to the British invasion. Then moved into the 70s a little bit with glam rock.
On the East Coast, magazines like Trouser Press were chronicling the new underground music scenes that were forming in New York and London.
We started Trouser Press when I was in college. Writing about music just felt really natural to me. We had a drafting table and a T-square and rubber cement and a waxer, and we pasted things together on paper boards and we brought them to a printer.
The underground press was dying, and what was coming in and taking its place was weeklies that were free and instead of charging, and they relied on advertising.
One of our early subscribers was Gene Simmons of Kiss. Kiss wasn't a very big band in those days. They were just a New York band that played in the same circles as some friends of mine played. I wish I'd kept the canceled checks, because that would have been funny.
I put out a fanzine in 1973. I edited and published a fanzine called Punk magazine. So I technically had the first magazine that was called Punk. And we had the Seeds were on the cover of our first issue. Blue Cheer was on the cover of the second issue.
Small magazines are very chancy propositions business-wise. I mean, it's very difficult to live on the advertising that a small magazine can sell. And the subscriptions. It's just a very difficult business.
So I did 2 issues of a fanzine called Noise, Noise, Noise. I had a friend whose father was a doctor, and we literally snuck into his father's office and used the Xerox machine to run off the copies of the thing. Probably cost him a fortune in toner.
I had a fanzine called Teenage Wasteland Cassette. I sent a copy to Richard Meltzer, I sent a copy to Natasha, to Lester Bangs, and they all were really, really supportive. And I was living with my parents, and every day I'd go to the mailbox, and there was like a stack of records this high.
In New York, there was Punk Magazine, Soho Weekly News, The Village Voice, but we all felt like New York Rocker was really the paper of record. They would make a point to cover things as honestly and accurately as they could, and also champion our local scene, whereas the other magazines might be more excited about the British bands coming over.
In 1973, a so-called Rock Writers Convention was held in Memphis, part Continental Congress for the rock critics, part publicity stunt for Ardent Records. The Rock Writers Convention brought an all-star list of music writers together for the first time for one fabled weekend.
So in 1973,
Ardent Records decided to bring a contingent of rock critics to see Big Star. They had an enormous budget, and they sent almost everybody from Creem, everyone from Fusion, everyone from Phonograph Record Magazine, everyone from Rolling Stone. Every rock critic extant was there, and we were as one.
from the West Coast, Shaw was in charge of that, I believe. Ken Barnes went, Mike Saunders, Cameron Crowe, David Redson, Todd Everett. A bunch of us flew down there from here, people from San Francisco, people from Detroit, and people from New York.
You know, I always remember Cameron Crowe was there. I just remember him playing a kazoo the entire weekend. He was like 15. He was like world's youngest rock critic.
There was a big meeting where we talked about forming a union and making sure that we got $25 a review. The first night in the lobby of the hotel, very nice hotel, all of a sudden, a bunch of really attractive, well-dressed women were like circulating through the lobby. Well, it turned out that they were professional women who heard there was a convention at this hotel and were looking for clients. And you're talking about guys who are making $25 a review and living with their mothers or whatever it was. But really, they got the idea apparently after a while, this isn't a fruitful market for us, you know.
But the idea that there were people from all over the country and that we were a bunch of this strange little breed of people who would rather write about music than do anything else, and virtually none of us were really making a living. We really were all doing this because we were passionate about it.
I'm Paul Collins, and I started in the band called The Nerves. This is the kind of rock journalism that we knew of in our town. The basic stuff you would see that was like covering, you know, the cool bands that we knew about, you know, stuff like this. And it was very basic, and it had a very basic cutout look to it. And even a lot of the artwork was similar. The posters were like this, just like real mimeograph stuff. The Dictators.
By the mid-70s, Creem magazine had stabled the creme de la creme of America's top music writers. While Rolling Stone was turning rock stars into celebrities and rock and roll into mainstream entertainment, Creem continued its irreverent assault on rock and roll royalty for a loyal international readership.
I'm embarrassed by reading some of these Detroit guys who talk about, well, maybe on the West Coast you were dancing in the streets with flowers in your hair, but in Detroit we were fighting the tanks with rocks. Okay, sure.
What was really important is at Creem females were more encouraged than at other rock magazines that I could see. And it was partly Dave Marsh and Lester both pushed that.
Everybody lived communally, nobody had money. Barry bought the groceries. He bought the pot, you know, he would come around on Friday and hand out little baggies to people. And it was just really weird.
John Morthland called me up. He was the interim editor, said, do you want to come out and be a copy boy? Lester and John Morthland picked me up in January of 1975 in Lester's rattle-trap red Camaro.
My father, Rick Siegel, was one of the founders of Creem. Starting out as photographer, wrote some articles, and then was the circulation manager, general manager, jack of all trades.
Tempers would flare. I lived and worked with a lot of really big personalities, and more often than not, like Dave Marsh would come up against Barry Kramer, and there would be a fight in the middle of like the office, you know? I mean, there would be times where Barry Kramer would get mad and throw a telephone through the light table, or someone would throw a typewriter through the window. I mean, it was a little scary.
I remember one tremendous fight of Lester versus Dave Marsh. Dave, being a tiny little wiry guy, his nickname was the Teenage Dwarf. One of them said Black Sabbath is just the Yardbirds slowed down, and then sped up the record to prove his point. And this led to verbal hostilities, and then it led to Dave jumping on Lester. They rolled off the couch and were rolling around on the floor, and Lester saying, "Don't make me hit you, you're too small, I will hurt you."
I kind of grew up in the Creem offices. I think most of the people who worked at Creem for more than a few days ended up at some point being my de facto babysitter, especially Lester, who I don't think really knew that the position was part of his job description. It was close to deadline, and he and Robert Duncan were furiously working on the magazine, by which I mean playing soccer around the office with wadded up pieces of paper. And every time one of them scored a goal, Lester would go over to the stereo and crank up the volume on Lou Reed's Metal Machine music, which sounded exactly like crowd noise. It was perfect. It was hysterical. But that was Creem. The irreverence, the deadline panic, the zaniness that managed to produce, you know, something really profound.
If rock journalism had a visual icon, it was Lester Bangs. Not only was Lester one of the first and one of the best, his over-the-top personality and charisma ensured that he was always part of the story. If there ever was a rock writer who became a rock star, it was Lester Bangs from El Cajon, California. Today, Lester has been immortalized in countless photos, posters, songs, and movies, including Cameron Crowe's Almost Famous.
Everybody loved Lester.
But if he thought you were imperious or a blowhard or self-satisfied, he would go after you with you know, a knife.
As Lester's biographer, I get these emails from people around the world, the Netherlands and Japan and Greece, you know, quoting lines that he wrote.
He was an incredibly gifted editor, incredibly disciplined writer and editor and proofreader. He would proofread every single story and cut line in that magazine.
It was his birthday, can't remember what year, and I decided I was going to have a party for him at my parents' house, and he came in and made his grand entrance right into the koi pond. But Lester, you know, he fell in the water. This was Lester. But he had his drink above the water.
What was great is that Lester could love an album one day and hate it the next, and that was wonderful. That he would just go off the deep end on one thing, and then 2 days later he'd come in and go, you know, Billy, that record really sucked.
He said, we got to come back to the apartment and hear this new record. So this other guy and I went to his apartment. I remember it was so filthy. And the record he'd just gotten that he was going to write about and had to put on for us to listen to was Lou Reed's Metal Machine music. And I mean, I maybe had a little appetite to try to stick it out. My friend was just like, "Oh," and left. "Come on, listen to this part here." And he would pick up the needle and put it up. It just is like grinding away this horrible stuff.
I was supposed to do a Jefferson Airplane story, and frankly, Grace Slick scared me. I mean, she had such a bad reputation of just eating journalists for lunch. I said, "Lester, you have got to do this story for me." He goes, "Oh, no problem." He comes back and he got her to expose her breast, you know? So, I mean, that was Lester.
And there was the time that Lester hit Barry on my behalf. Barry was very paternal, and he would count out the money for me before I went on this trip, and he was also giving me instruction in terms of, okay, when you're in the suite too, I don't want anyone up there with you, no guys up there, and don't you do this and don't you do that. And I just sort of like started crying and ran out of the office into our old 1920s ladies' room. So Lester comes busting into the ladies' room. He had no qualms about that. He's like, "What's the matter?" And I'm like, I don't even know if I could say anything. It was like, "Barry." And so he goes, "Oh, okay." And he went running back into editorial. But I could hear boom, boom. And like, that was okay. That was kind of the way the office was. You didn't get fired if you hit the boss, you know.
Rolling Stone ran a story. It was one of the last interviews that John Lennon did, and I think it was right before he died. And in the middle of the interview, he said, one critic that I've always admired was Lester Bangs. But I would think anybody would be honored to have John Lennon say that you were his favorite critic, that he really admired you. I just thought it was really sad that, Lester didn't live long enough to see that.
The 60s didn't really take place in the 60s. Something happened when Nixon resigned. It was the Oedipal urge fulfilled. We had slain the father figure, we had gotten rid of the president of the United States, and it felt a little bit like we had done it. Nixon went away and the Vietnam War ended. I would start it in 64 and I would go to, when did Nixon resign? 74. There's your 60s.
There was a lot of people thought that every 10 years this has got to happen. So 64 Beatles, 74, okay, it's time again, it's going to be here.
By 1975, the 1960s were definitely over. The Vietnam War ended. Bell-bottoms, long hair, and tie-dye were passé. Many young people rejected peace, love, and hippiedom and sought out the urban grit of New York and London, and they found a sound that combined garagey anti-musicianship with the short, snappy sounds of 1950s rock and roll.
I kind of dated from Patti Smith at the St. Mark's in the Bowery poetry reading.
Bowery was empty. It was alcoholics. There were drugs. There were prostitutes. It was not a place a respectable businessman would go down.
When punk came along, that gave rock journalists something new to write about.
It demanded its own publication, its own fanzines, its own writers.
But the other thing was this profound dissatisfaction with what was going on.
And it turned out that, of course, musicians cared a lot about the money, and the Stones became less a band than a business proposition.
And all this really pretentious prog rock was not interesting. And you go a little bit later to the middle 70s and it becomes AOR rock, which is pretty faceless corporate stuff. So there's plenty of dissatisfaction.
About 1976, 1977, the punk rock revolution started. First in New York, then in England, then in LA.
When my friend Mick Farron wrote, the Titanic Sails at Dawn, I think it's called, which was a piece that kind of like 3 months before the Sex Pistols released Anarchy in the UK, kind of prefigured the mood that was happening in England at the time that led to a band like the Pistols happening.
3-minute songs and a memorable hook. I didn't need 20-minute guitar solos.
It was time to get back to 3 chords and just talking about teenage experiences like Chuck Berry did.
The Dictators introduced the blueprint for the New York sound. Fueled by rock writers Sandy Pearlman and Andy Chernoff, the Dictators donned leather jackets and t-shirts to record punk rock's first album, The Dictators Go Girl Crazy.
Our record was out a year before the Ramones.
The Dictators seemed to speak to so many of us in that rock writer community about this is exactly what we've been hoping for. This is like the second coming. It's finally here.
At Creem, we fell in love with the Dictator.
I actually have no recollection of much of what went down making the record because it was so much fun.
We went to see the Dictators when they came out here to play the Whiskey for the first time.
We ran a tape of everything that Handsome Dick said. And he said a lot because there's no way to keep his mouth shut. So he said a lot unless he was too drunk to talk. So he just kept on babbling, and we recorded it all, and you put it in between the songs.
And Meltzer and I were at the same table. We were standing on the chairs, yelling the words to every song out. I mean, we were now 30 years old. These guys going, I think Lou Reed is a creep. And the guys I work with looking at me and say, I've never seen Gene behave like this before. What is this? But that was a measure of how deeply the dictators touched us, man. This is so great.
1 year later, another band, the Ramones, ultimately brought punk rock to the mainstream.
I was walking down the street and I saw a poster for the Ramones, and I saw Joey Ramone. I mean, he was this weird, tall guy wearing like satin pants, looking like the guy who got beat up in high school because he was the guy who got beat up in high school.
I remember being in Lester's red Camaro in Detroit, him blasting the Ramones. He fell instantly in love with the Ramones.
I wrote one of the first rave reviews of the Ramones record in Creem. If you didn't rave about that record, you should have your card revoked,
There were maybe 15 people in the audience. Ramones came on. They did like 15 songs in like 10 minutes. Before this, I was sitting and listening to drum solos longer than their whole set,
And it seemed like people really read the press. A man named Alan Betrock, who founded the New York Rocker. He gave a full spread to the Nerves. That was the centerpiece of our promotion. We booked an entire national tour around that article. That's how powerful and important the press was.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, a word from our sponsor.
We're your type for memos and manuscripts, love letters for labels and laundry lists. If words are the way you write, we're your type. Typewriters, IBM, for contract checks, for doctor's orders, for company checks, police headquarters, for offices big and businesses small. We're your type.
Wherever there were rock stars, there were rock writers. To many, the writers were stars in their own right. They were backstage, in the hotel rooms, on the tour buses and private planes. They were flies on the wall.
The fact that I got to go on 2 Led Zeppelin tours was like a rite of passage for me. The second one I went on was pretty bizarre. I'd been on the tour for like 2 weeks, and it was kind of the Almost Famous thing where they wouldn't talk to me. And then I had to go to Jimmy Page's room. He looked at me and said, I'm not going to speak to you directly. I'm going to speak to the publicist. Everything you need to ask me, you'll ask her first. And so I had to ask every question to the publicist, and she would translate it to him like we didn't speak the same language. And it went on for an hour. I thought, oh my God, thought balloons could kill. And at the end, he looked at me and he said, I'm having a party tonight. And I go, oh, you are? And he goes, you're not invited. I go, well, I think that goes without saying. I wouldn't come. And I just left the room.
Rod Stewart and the Faces was my first Creem event that I went to a show. We were backstage, and Ronnie Wood, who was with the Faces at the time, he said, Lester, how would you like to go to a party at David Ruffin's house? We're like, yeah. We get there was just elegant people at this party. We're a bunch of crazy rock kids with t-shirts and jeans on. But they're very nice to us anyway. There's David Ruffin. He's got this beautiful redheaded girlfriend who Lester immediately starts dirty dancing with. We ended up in a back bedroom singing. Like, here I am singing with David Ruffin, and Lester's singing, and Ronnie Wood's playing guitar, and Lester's making up words, many of which are too rude to even mention.
We learned that the secret was to go to the press parties because you could actually eat. The big record companies were feeding all the rock critics, and not only could you eat and drink that afternoon, but you could put the lunch meat in your pockets, and then tomorrow and maybe the next day you could have a meal as well.
Paul Nelson called me up, the great, wonderful Paul Nelson, who at the time was editor of Circus magazine, and he said, hey, I love your writing, I'd love to get you, have you do some have you do some work for us? And so I started writing for Circus. Eventually I was freelancing for every godforsaken rock magazine there is in America, and still not barely making my $200 a month rent. In fact, without the selling promo copies of records, like most record reviewers, I wouldn't have made the rent.
Elton John went out to Detroit, and Lester did an interview with him. And so he talked about the fact in the interview, he was asking Elton John about the fact that critics really didn't like him that much, and how did he feel about criticism, because he's very successful, but he doesn't get many great reviews. And Elton John said, well, I don't mind people, it's fine for anybody to have an opinion. And he said, but sometimes, people say things, if they say something interesting or funny, and then he said, like that review you guys had in Creem, and then he starts quoting the jokes. But that was when I realized, my God, people might actually read this.
Not only were the musicians and the writers at the bar together every night and really flying flags of truce and carrying on conversations about what was exploding in the scene, but the writers themselves were becoming musicians because all the filters were gone. You didn't have to go through 3 levels of secretaries to get up on stage and play.
It never seemed fair to me that somebody could come to a show and the whole room enjoyed the thing and liked it and everybody had a good time, and this person says it stunk. They say it in print. So people who weren't there, that's what they think happened.
So it was Olympia Stadium. Paul McCartney and Wings were playing. We were determined to get backstage at any cost, in any way. We did. And finally, we're in the inner sanctum. We got into the actual dressing room, and there's Lester on the other side. And Lester's kind of like, how'd you guys get in here? And we're just like, don't out us, don't get us out of here. And Paul and Linda were doing sort of like a receiving line, and Lester was already there, of course, and then there was Eric and I were shaking hands with Paul and Linda, and it's like, hi, I'm from Creem Magazine, hi, I'm from Creem Magazine. By the time they got to Eric, Paul's like, what, are all of you from Creem Magazine?
I had a great experience with Bruce Springsteen, who was always very nice. I got to go on tour with him down in the South. Got to ride on the bus and all. That was great fun. I wrote a story about it, and I felt really good about the story. It was right around this time they went to see Bruce the first time he played Madison Square Garden. When Bruce finally arrived after an hour or so after the concert was over, he walked in the room, and we were sitting at a table way in the back, and Bruce Springsteen walked past all the celebrities and walked to our table, sat down, and said, that's my favorite story.
For me, Kiss was like pretty much fell in my lap. I just really got them. I thought, oh my God, this is an idea, its time's come. Like there is something really big about this band. So I called up Casablanca Records and I said, I would love to join the band for a day and I'd like to do a story on it. And I thought I was out of my mind. And I called back and I go, no, I'm really serious. I'll give it a big spread. We'll do a really good thing. I'll take a photographer with me and we'll document the whole thing. And finally they gave in. They said, you can do it if you promise not to call them a glitter band. I go, I promise, I promise. And they would show up at our offices and slap on their makeup. Detroiters like things that are very direct, no irony, like hit us in the face. It's like the factory.
Independently, both Lester Bangs and Dave Marsh recommended me to Barry Kramer, the publisher at Creem. So I negotiated with Barry to be like the review editor / New York editor, because Creem had no offices in New York. It was my living room. So I literally mailed in the review section every month for almost 10 years. And all the writers around the country literally mailed me their reviews in the mail. And then I edited them, and then I mailed them to the magazine.
Ted Nugent, I think we always thought was a little bit of a joke. We were merciless. We wouldn't let him off the hook. But the thing is Ted Nugent is such a bully. My girlfriends and I were hitchhiking to McDonald's, and the Amboy Dukes picked us up, and he was just insufferable. Like one of those people that just make you feel small. He makes other people feel small so he can feel bigger.
I did the first story in the Police that we ever ran, and I had to interview them in a gay bar. We went there because it was quiet. And it was kind of funny because Sting was probably at the height of his male beauty, whatever, and there we are. We're in with all these gay guys in the bar. I could tell that he was making a big hit with them. He was a very popular guy in there.
During the 70s, I became more professional oriented magazines that existed, Mix, and I know Guitar Player, which started actually in the 60s, became something where professional musicians were able to read about other musicians and have reviews of their albums.
Yet, being a music critic was work. Always on the road and under deadline, always chasing the story, the rock writers had to turn on the tape recorder, ask the right questions, and start typing on a moment's notice.
The Clash, I remember when they were at the Motor City roller rink. That was a great assignment. I loved it because Joe Strummer kept telling me, yeah, he was going to make time for the interview after the show, but first let's do this. First, let's go have a drink at a real kind of working class Detroit bar. Okay, so I took him to Lily's. People followed us from the gig and came into Lily's, and I heard them behind us saying, see, don't ever tell me not to follow people anymore, because look, we got the Clash are at Lily's. So, but then we went to the hotel where all the guys in the Clash, Joe, me, we were kind of sprawled on like beds and you know, on chairs and everything, and we were having a sing-along. And Joe kept saying to me, we'll do the interview after this. We'll do it after this. I'm telling you, it's like 3 in the morning at least. And finally, it was dawn. It was daybreak. And Joe said, okay, we'll go to my room. We'll do the interview now. So we did.
I really did not like the music critics. I felt it wasn't fair that people were writing reviews who were not musicians. Whereas in the book field, if you write a book, you review somebody else's book. So therefore, when a critic would come out and talk about good rock and roll and bad rock and roll, it was annoying.
Used to be you could get about 40 records a week in the mail. That many things were sent out. And at the time, there were certain record stores that would give you $1 a record if it was sealed. If it was unsealed, it was usually 35 cents. But you could make, you know, $20, $30 a week from the junk that they sent you.
Leonard Skinner was a really important story for me. I took my tape recorder, put on my highest heels because I had a feeling this was going to be a tough interview, and went and met him in a bar in Detroit. A couple of them kept making fun of me for being a woman, you know. It was like, what does a girl know about rock and roll? But for some reason, Ronnie Van Zant came to my defense. He said, come over here, we'll talk. So I went into a corner booth and we started talking, and we talked for about an hour, and he looked me straight in the eye and he said, you know, I'm not going to live very much longer. And I go, what? I go, you know, you're just tired. It's the last day of the tour. And he goes, no, I'm not going to see 30. I said, oh, no. He goes, I have Janis Joplin disease. You know, lo and behold, it turned out he was right, I was wrong. I remember being at a show, and they had announced at the show that Leonard Skinner had a plane crash and there were some survivors, and I knew immediately that he hadn't survived.
If you had to pick my favorite assignment, it would probably be George Harrison. He was funny, charming, just really accommodating, just really nice. Axl Rose, he wouldn't have used a public restroom. He would have said, I need a private restroom. But no, George got in line with everybody, and you know, everybody's a little you know, surprised and excited. There's a former Beatle in line with them to use the men's room. And this was a time where the follically challenged men in the business, they would have ponytails. There were a lot of ponytails in Los Angeles in 1987. And so when they got into the men's room, George looked at a couple people, my brother and some of my friends among them, and he looked, he says, do you have to have a ponytail in this room to take a leak? And that's my George Harrison story.
Ron Wood put together a band with Keith Richards called the New Barbarians. This was like 78 or 79, and I got an assignment to go interview Ron Wood, and we got to get in all the limos and drive out to the private airfield in outside Newark and get on a private jet and fly to Baltimore for a gig. Eventually I found myself in a room with Keith Richards and Ron Wood and Ian McLagan, and I realized it's like 3 in the morning, and I told my wife I might be home by then. I said, hey, could I use the phone? They said, yeah, it's in the bedroom there. So I went in the bedroom. The bedroom's like this, you know, white shag rug, white bedspread, white end tables, night tables by the bed. And so I take the phone and I pull it towards me, and I pick it up, and I'm dialing home. And I've just shoveled a whole mound of white powder off the night table onto the white shag rug. And I'm like, oh man, sorry, no problem,
I did a piece for Creem when I went on the road with the Ramones in Texas, and a lot of people liked that piece a lot. I mean, I spent 3 or 4 days with them in their van driving through Texas. They were on the tour with the Runaways. So it was perfect. It was an old girl group, an old boy group, and people were just throwing bottles at them on stage. And I got to be great friends with them.
We started being limited to only shooting the first 3 songs. Yeah. As far as I remember, Pat Benatar was the first artist to say first 3 songs only. Pat always had the pixie hair and this and that, and quite honestly, with all due respect to Pat and her talent and stuff, after the second song, she looked like a wet cat, and not very flattering. And one of the writers may have pointed that out and put that in a caption underneath it. And so subsequently, as far as I remember, Pat Benatar was the first artist to say first 3 songs only.
I was the one that would come in earliest because Connie was such a taskmaster. She said, somebody has to be in the office at noon. So she said, Bill, you're the one. So I had to be in there at noon. And one day I'm sitting there and the phone rings and they say it's Billy Joel on line 1. And we always got calls like that, somebody saying it's Bruce Springsteen or somebody. And sometimes it really would be, but 9 times out of 10 it was just somebody trying to get through the editorial, which we answered the phone anyway. But I thought it was going to be a smart ass. Sure enough, it was Billy Joel. And he was really upset. What he was upset about was there was a caption. He was dating Christy Brinkley at that point, and Christy Brinkley was waving, and the caption underneath it said, "Dating a moron? Why, I am." And he says, when you pick on me, that's one thing. He says, but when you pick on my girlfriend, them's fighting words. And I had to point out to him that actually we weren't making fun of his girlfriend. The girlfriend was making fun of him.
My all-time favorite Creem cover headline was a Madonna headline that I actually must confess to writing, and that headline was "Inside Madonna," in a manner of speaking. Okay. I was very proud of that.
Trade magazines that came from in-house, Warner Brothers and Reprise would send out in the 70s what they called Circular, which was a magazine that had all their latest hype on their new releases. Tower Records to help give people a little more information about the albums that they were selling in their stores, put out a publication called Pulse.
Like, okay, journalists have to say something. They got to write about this and they got to sound smart. If you do this to make a living, then your relationship with the rock writer or the rock writers, or journalism in general, takes on a different meaning. In the beginning, for me, when they started calling what we did power pop and new wave, we hated it. I hated it. We're a rock and roll band. The Nerves were a rock and roll band. And at that point in time, it hurt us. Rock radio was not going to play new wave, was not going to play punk rock, was not going to play power pop. Now, fast forward to today, those words have completely changed. Now, power pop for me is a good thing.
As the 70s wore on, there were signs that the golden age was coming to an end. Rock and roll wasn't rebellion anymore, it was big business. The baby boomers and their counterculture were growing up, and the rock critics' world was starting to shrink.
Tasha's and Meltzer would say it was dead by 74, and the first issue of People magazine put the nail in the coffin.
They don't care about rock magazines. They'll do interviews with rock magazines because they know it helps sell their records and stuff. But the really prestige thing is to be in People magazine. The thing is, that's not rock writing, that's celebrity journalism.
Everything was becoming more managed. You can't just go hang out with a band, you had to go through a publicist.
The growth of all those papers, that the USA Todays of the world, and when LA Times and the Detroit Free Press, and when they all had their own rock critics, there was a competition to get access to these artists. So suddenly, it wasn't the easy kill it was long ago.
You started to see the space that you were given to write being cut down so they could have an even bigger, beautiful color photograph there. And the text almost felt like it was a caption for this photo.
By 1980, 81, I noticed finally that there was something called rock surround. It was everywhere.
I stayed at Rolling Stone somewhere into the beginning of the 80s. The magazine moved to New York in 1977 and basically oversaw West Coast operations, and then just decided this is just not the same as having everybody in one building.
By 1981, the paradigm was shifting further. The new decade ushered in the video age, video games, personal computers, music videos. Young people relied less and less on print media, such as the magazines. Now the goal was to get a video in rotation on MTV.
What happened to print journalism since the advent of MTV? Wow.
MTV created a situation that was pretty disastrous for print journalism. All we could do was write about things, and describe them and run a picture here and there.
It used to be if you wanted to find out what was going on in the world of rock, you'd have to wait every month or every 2 weeks. That changed instantly when somebody could come on MTV and they could say, hey, the Stray Cats tour just canceled. It's not going to happen, guys.
It just didn't feel like what we were doing was as important as it had been because somebody else was doing it better.
And I had just done an interview with Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols where he detailed everything. He detailed every burglary that he pulled to steal the equipment that the Sex Pistols played on and all that sort of stuff. And I couldn't get anybody interested in running this interview, believe it or not.
Most of the British bands that I knew, that I became friends with, would look forward to going to Detroit because Creem was there. Once MTV came along, it became, okay, you're second or third on the list because we're going to do this for MTV.
So you had people like Cameron Crowe become a famous movie director, or you had people like Mike Saunders become an accountant for a hospital. I mean, it was the whole spectrum.
But is all this change really a bad thing? For many, MTV created a much-needed revolution. The 80s saw baby boomers pass the countercultural torch to Generation X. The new generation demanded instantaneous information 24/7, as only cable TV channels such as MTV and CNN could provide.
There were music videos for decades, really. And I guess the first one for me was Hard Day's Night.
Ed Sullivan announced he would have the new Beatles record on, and then they played Strawberry Fields, and it was a video.
And that's how it all happened at MTV too. 1980, there was this big explosion of satellite cable channels. CNN happened.
Initially, the good videos were all British, so there were, people like Joe Jackson. They had huge hits because people went and they saw them on television. They went out and bought the records. They weren't getting played on the radio.
Well, in 1984, the Cable Act deregulated the television industry, and there was this huge wiring of America. At one point, we had 110 songs that we were putting in rotation, which most radio stations had about 24.
Today, rock magazines are still alive, and there's a newfound interest in preserving their early legacy. Rolling Stone is a national institution and a frequent mouthpiece for everything concerning rock and roll and youth culture. In addition, there are other points of light as the baby boomers now are in a position to spend both the time and money to re-explore their youth. Much like the resurgence of classic rock and vinyl records, could we soon see a resurgence of the rock and roll magazine?
This year I went to South by Southwest and proposed the idea of doing a panel on Paul Williams because he had passed away just 6 months before that. South by Southwest has, at its foundation was a place where rock journalists and musicians came together.
So when Almost Famous came out, I set out with really doing two things, which is creating an archive of everything and putting together a nice coffee table book collection that represented what meant the most to me about Creem.
This is the ex-employees of Rolling Stone. The ex-employees of Rolling Stone had a picnic out here a couple years ago, and I went to and such. And some of the Jaan stories are probably not necessary to be read right at this time.
Rock and roll is a physical medium. Printed word should reflect that too. It should be physical. It should be something you can hold in your hand and feel. In 1983, I started my own rock and roll fanzine called Ugly Things. I wanted to focus on like 60s garage bands and obscure psychedelia.
In fall 2014, the Birmingham Historical Museum near Detroit exhibited old Creem magazine photos, layouts, and assorted memorabilia. Organized by former Creem photographer Charlie Oranger, editor Susan Whitall, and museum curator Leslie Pelak, the exhibit brought back the days in the Creem offices when Barry Kramer, Lester Bangs, Dave Marsh, and Jaan Uhelszki ruled over the typewriters. But rock journalism cannot exist without a strong music scene. So the question arises, is rock and roll dead or alive? Do the values that drove the music in the 1960s and 70s still apply today? What happened to the so-called soundtrack of the revolution?
3, 2, 1. Rock and roll was a lifestyle, it was a philosophy, it was a zeitgeist, it was a way of life. Today it's just another diversion.
But it comes down to access. I mean, we would get days or we would get hours, and now very often you get 15 minutes. And how can you get a story in 15 minutes? You get a soundbite.
There was a very specific period of time in the 60s that rock and roll was the soundtrack for the entire generation.
Because there was only limited media channels, the Beatles could go on Ed Sullivan and be seen by millions and millions of people.
The world has changed. There's nothing new anymore.
My roots were in the 70s, so, you know, I saw rock in a different light. I did see them as heroes. They were like shamans. They were people to follow. They were imparting wisdom.
It was one time the voice of a generation. Now it's used to sell cars.
One was for Depends adult diapers. It's like an ending we never could have predicted.
It'll be interesting to see how all that social media and television and all this new media kind of congeals.
Seeing The Clash when I was 14 years old literally was what set me on my path. I went to see them on the London Calling Tour, I believe it was, here at the Armadillo World headquarters, and I'm standing on Mick Jones's side of the stage. And I'm looking up at him jumping around with a Les Paul around his neck and rockabilly clothing, and I'm thinking that's what I want to be when I grow up.